We don't know how many people are in our countries. We don't even have numbers. We round to the nearest million on illegals.
Millions.
We've vastly underestimated our appeal and the number of people who want to come here. And if we don't have a sensible policy about this century is going to be a real problem.
You said riots in Britain should be a warning to the U.S. And
the issue of that I touched on there were these riots recently in Britain, which I predicted for many years would happen. One of the reasons they happen, there are lots of reasons.
Douglas Murray is going to talk about the immigration problems we're dealing with today. He'll look at how immigration has changed over the years and why it's become more complicated now. Murray will help explain what's caused these changes and what impact it's having on our society, economy, politics, and why it's almost impossible to reverse this trend. It's a chance to get a better understanding of why this issue is such a big deal today.
One is that Britain, like America, has lost control of its borders. And on top of that, legal migration in the UK is at a historic high, legal net migration. Just to give some historic context, in the 1990s, legal net migration per year was in the tens of thousands. When the Conservative government left office earlier this year, it was at 750,000. Now that's net migration.
legal. Okay.
Plus tens of thousands of people coming illegally on boats and through other means, possibly in the hundreds of thousands, that one as well. People tend to find that the easiest bit to talk about in a way is the illegal migration. But what I was showing in that piece was that even if you take the legal migration in a country like Britain, which is very similar to all other Western European countries, you get this situation where it's got a benefit that's very clear to the government because the migrants, of course, do add. They add financially, but not in the ways that everybody thinks. So in this particular case, the government can say, we've added X number of jobs into the workforce. But what they don't say is most of them have gone to people who were not born here. And my view is it kind of breaks one of the pacts between the electorate and the elected, which is that the electorate vote generally for something they think will make their lives better. They don't vote for something to make the lives of people who don't yet live in the country better. Mm-hmm. And so one of the points I've made for many years about this is if you grow the pie, but you give the pie to people who haven't been there for the baking, as it were, you break part of the pact. And the British electorate are pretty mad about this subject. And some of them, as they showed last month, are very mad indeed about it. I think that's it's a problem that's perfectly possible to deal with. There's no reason why a country like Britain or America cannot have an immigration system that brings in, talented people who are not going to be any kind of burden on the welfare state, and for whom the benefit of their migration doesn't just accrue to them. And that's one of the other things in this area that's very important is that the benefit of the migration largely accrues to the migrant, not to the society, in terms of the finance.
The benefit of is more towards a migrant than the society. Yes. So meaning people coming in are winning more than the people that have been loyal to that country all these years.
Yes.
So how does that logically make any sense? How does that logically make any sense to, not treat your kids as good as you treat, someone else's? I mean, you have to treat everybody equally, but it's your kids, it's your community, it's your people. Someone has to be sold that idea logically to say, yeah, that's the right thing we're doing.
People in the UK are receiving less support, and as Patrick pointed out, that's not normal. It's like your own kids or a community are being overlooked, while more help is being given to someone you just met 10 seconds ago. There's a growing feeling that locals are being left behind in favor of outsiders, and that imbalance is becoming a real concern for many. It's a situation that raises important questions about priorities and fairness within the system.
I don't think they do, actually. I think you can fall into it from habit. There are lots of things that can make you feel better in the short term as people that are just not good for us, but they can make you feel better. I mean, if you laced my coffee with, I would feel better. But there are lots of things in the short term could make you feel better, but are not good for you long term. Mass migration like that can make you feel better in the short term. As I say, it does grow the pie a little bit. It's just that people don't get a share in it. And the problem with the migration question, this is a problem that the Republicans will have to deal with here if they win in November, is that none of the answers to this are easy. I mean, it's like a drug. It's very easy to get into and quite hard to get off. In fact, very hard to get off. Take things like in Italy. It's a country I know pretty well. They had several years ago an election in which the main conservative running said that he was going to deport the 1 million illegals, which was estimated there were in Italy. I was never clear, even if he won the election, how he could do that. How on earth do you deport 1 million people?
Let alone 11 to 20 million in the U.S.
Right. And I have asked politicians in this country exactly the same question. How exactly do you do that? I mean, government in America, like everywhere, is not that great at doing a lot of things. How on earth would you pull something like that off? My point is that when it comes to the issue of migration, what actually happens is it's just so hard to fix after you've opened the door that basically nobody does. I don't yet know of a Western country that has lost control of its immigration like America has or like Britain has, that has any idea of how to correct it. And I'm not against immigration per se. I believe that a society should have a sane immigration policy. Allow talented people in, allow a certain number of people in for humanitarian reasons, in exceptional circumstances. This benefits the society. But it doesn't benefit it if instead of being a sort of trickle of a tributary into the society as a whole, it's a flood, which you then can't do anything about.
Deport over 1 million immigrants, but the reality is far more complicated. For deportation to happen, these individuals must first be accepted by their home countries. Additionally, once a border has been opened, closing it becomes extremely difficult. And while deportation poses significant challenges involving international agreements and legal frameworks, we have to acknowledge that, in some cases, immigration can bring benefits to society.
And although a lot of politicians in America and Europe read the book, I was under the impression that they didn't know what to do about it. One politician said to me on the continent in Europe, this is a very depressing book for me to read. Mm-hmm. I said, you should have tried writing it. These are really big problems in the 21st century. And as you know, they're made particularly big, not just by the inability of Western leaders to do anything about it, but by the fact that 50 years ago, it was hard to get to America from Venezuela. 50 years ago, it was hard to get to Europe from sub-Saharan Africa. Today, travel is cheaper and easier than it's ever been, and everybody knows how other people in the world are living. I mean, that's one of the things that these devices we all have, we've underestimated. Everywhere I go in the world, you've been the poorest township in South Africa, everyone's got a device in their hands, and they can see what life could be like. And even if it's a life that we might not regard as being great ourselves, it's a lot better than a lot of the world. So I think in general, the liberal democracies, the capitalist countries, we've vastly underestimated our appeal and the number of people who want to come here. And if we don't have a sensible policy about this century is going to be a real problem.
For context, Douglas was asked why we don't establish a research base to identify the best candidates for immigration.
Because it doesn't work at scale. That's my view. I mean, it should be able to work, but it doesn't at the moment. The work you would put in to research somebody for a major position in your company is simply not the work that any government can do about the number of people coming into a country like America at the moment. Most people think the size of the state is a little bloated at the moment. Can you imagine how much bigger the state would have to be to do that kind of background research on everyone walking across the southern border? I don't think you could do it. It actually is hard to pull up data because nobody collects that data.
If I was to pull up right now...
You're not allowed to collect that data in most countries.
Why? In the U.S. we can. You're saying in Europe, most countries you cannot?
Most countries you're not allowed
Why
to
is that
data.
considered
Because
what? Discrimination?
The facts would be what Kathy Newman would call racist. I mean, for instance, I was in Poland probably last about 18 months ago, and they've had a huge influx, of course, of Ukrainians, Ukrainian women primarily, since the beginning of the war. Now, I can't remember how many it is. It's more than 1 million, 2 million, I think. That's a lot of people for a relatively small by American standards, country like Poland to deal with. How is it not led to, I don't know, suicide bombings, outbreaks of rapes, and so on and so forth? Because Ukraine to Poland is not that big of a leap in cultural terms. And the Polish are, relatively happy to welcome in their neighbors in this distress because they are their neighbors, and the Poles know that this could happen to them, and they'd hope that if this happened to them, their neighbors would help them. That's quite different to, say, Sweden taking in large numbers of people from Somalia, because we know that, Somalia, which has had terrible, terrible civil wars and violence for many years now, and this is not the fault of the people in that benighted country, but it's inevitable that if a large number of people from Somalia, particularly young men, land in your country, they will bring a certain level of violence, which the Ukrainian women moving into Poland will not bring. Now, that's common sense, but it's also difficult.
The cultural differences between countries are significant, and as Douglas pointed out, some nations have recently emerged from war, which isn't their fault. However, this reality can lead to a tendency for increased violence in some cases due to the trauma and instability they've experienced.
And the desire, as Kathy Newman shows there, to simply say, well, that's racist, or the facts are racist, is overwhelming. And at the moment, that still works in terms of shutting down any of this discussion. I always say there are only three things with immigration that really matter: speed, numbers, and identity. Speed, numbers, and identity. You can integrate large numbers of people relatively fast if the identity is pretty close. You can integrate a small number of people with a very different identity if it's a small number and the speed is slow. If you do fast, large numbers with a very different identity, you've not got a hope of integrating. You've just not got a hope. Why would they? They can live in communities with other people who are like them, and they don't need to be part of your society. And if you have no punishment, as it were, for not integrating, then there's no incentive. And one other thing, so remember what we're dealing with in the 21st century is a lot of people leaving very benighted countries where the standard of living is just horrific by our standards, when they come into societies like this one, Western societies in general, particularly with the welfare state, you can have a much better standard of living than you could dream of in the country you've come from. We don't know what to do about that. We just don't know what to do about it. America in particular, but Western Europe as well, is too attractive.